study of Leviticus chapters 1 to 5, titled The Purpose of the Sanctuary. Now, before I go on to Leviticus 1 to 5, I'm going to quickly do a recap of some points that you should have learnt. Just so bear them in mind as we continue our studies. Firstly, evening and morning makes up the day, i.e. sunset to sunset, and the word day can either refer to the daylight part or the whole 24-hour part. Some of the appointed times of God's holy convocations were set up in Genesis 1:14, where it says seasons. Others, such as Passover and unleavened bread, were added as memorials in Exodus chapter 12 event, or memorials of the Exodus chapter 12 event. Woman and wife have the same Hebrew word. The difference is one has a husband and the other does not. God's way of living and laws existed before creation of Israel. For example, murder of Abel by Cain, the first fruits offerings, Noah being a righteous person, whilst the others committed sin and God killed them because they departed from his way. Abraham kept God's laws, commandments and statutes, and God saw that he would raise his children to do the same. Both Noah and Abraham offered burnt offerings. Clean and unclean animals existed as Noah separated them. 8 people came through the flood. There's Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. The world was populated by Noah and these sons, but we do not know what colour any were, as that would necessitate knowing the colour of both parents, which we are not told. Both Esau and Jacob were the same, except that Esau had long reddish hairs on his body, though both were of the same skin colour. We saw this in Josephus' writings. Gentiles means nations, and later becomes to mean the nations without God once Israel was created. Abraham circumcised all his household, for example, 318 men who went with him to rescue Lot. Abraham, Isaac and Jacob got their wealth through others. Abraham and Isaac through Pharaoh's thinking their wives were their sister, Jacob via Laban, and Israel a nation by spoiling the Egyptians after the plagues when they came out. Though we are told 70 direct descendants of Jacob went into Egypt, they also took all their household goods, including the servants. In fact, the servants outnumbered them by a big ratio. Remember, Abraham's ratio was him and Ishmael to 318 men when they circumcised them. Jacob went to Laban as one man and came out with many, so much so that when he met Esau, he can divide them into different groups. His 12 sons were from 4 different women, of whom we only know that 2 were related to him via Laban's daughters. Judah married Canaanite women. Joseph's sons were via an Egyptian wife. Just so the composition of Israel initially. When Dinah got raped in Genesis 34, Simeon and Levi took all the children and women of Shechem's nation and incorporated them into their household or the households. We learn from Joseph's interpretation of the dreams that to interpret does not mean to translate one language or sound to another, but to explain the meaning of the words. The difference is everyone can hear the language, such as the servants in the prison. Everyone heard what the story was about them, but only Joseph was able to tell them what it meant. And he did the same with Pharaoh, which is how he rose to become second in command of Egypt. All the patriarchs were taken out of Egypt for burial, so none stayed in there. The group who went into Egypt lived in a separate part of Egypt called Goshen. After 430 years, the descendants of this group, including the servants, came out as one mixed multitude whom God called my people, or congregation of Israel, or sometimes just Israel. So when we see any of those terms, we are not to think how we think of them today, in terms of the inhabitants of one piece of land, or that they're all the same in colour, or they all have the same ancestry, i.e. being direct descendants of Jacob. If you read the prophets' subsequent references to this group and think they are divided by colour, bloodline or other, you would be wrong. They had different ancestry, but were identified by their following of the same God primarily. I'm not going to go into that now. Excluding those who joined them later and were classed as strangers. That is a precept, not other false precepts that others of today try to introduce when they try to steer people's minds into a certain direction and to accept certain untrue biblical things. And people not knowing the Bible might accept those precepts in their ignorance. We cannot go by who is resident in the country today, as some people do start today and then go backwards to the Bible. As we shall see, as we continue reading the Bible, people were dispersed. For example, the Egyptians thought that Jacob's descendants may one day outnumber them, and that was only after 430 years. Those people who proclaim some of these differentiations of colour today, they also claim that the inhabitants of some Caribbean islands, for example, were only created over 400 years ago when people were taken from Africa and taken there. So if a country's population can change over 400 years, imagine what could have happened over 3,000 years. Okay, there were 10 plagues for the purpose of executing judgment against all the false gods worshipped by Egypt and Israel. Obviously been in Egypt for 430 years, so they worshipped Egyptian gods. It was also to establish who God was, the God of their ancestors, and giving them confidence in Moses as their leader. God taught them his name, his laws, and his character. We ended with showing there is really no such thing as 10 commandments. That is a mistranslation or division based on the people getting afraid after after the 10th one. That's Exodus chapters 20 verses 18 to 21. God gave them a list of regulations by which to live. Moses wrote those down in a book and made a covenant of them, Exodus chapters 24 verses 4 and 7. I call that a part A, i.e. the things what God said you ought to do or things you're not to do. God then called Moses up to the mount to get all the commandments between chapters 25 to 31. He wrote those on stone. Those consisted of building a sanctuary system that I then called a part B. Leviticus will now explain how to use that part B and its purpose. In short, to accept offerings and sacrifices through the priest and also to forgive transgressions of part A. We shall see that B shall be the sanctuary system administered by the Levites who represented God's forgiveness part. The sanctuary system will have 3 concepts: a temple, a priest, and a sacrifice.
I ended the notes on Exodus showing the 2 complementary parts of God's system, A and B. One part cannot replace the other. Each has a different makeup and purpose. So whether part B is an animal sacrifice or the Messiah sacrifice, it cannot and does not replace any of the components of part A, i.e. the laws that are to be kept, i.e. thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt keep the Sabbath day, and so forth. Were that the case, it would mean we can now kill, steal, murder, and it would not be a sin that needs forgiveness, in which case there would be no need for Jesus to be here or to have come. All the laws listed in part A were given as one set, so we cannot separate or take out any one from the set. The set or list has to be kept in its entirety. Thus James said, if we break one, we break them all, because they are a set. For example, break one leg of a table and you have broken the table. James chapter 2 verse 10 says, whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. For he that said, do not commit adultery, said also, do not kill. Now if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou art become a transgressor of the law. Cannot be any clearer. We will now look into part B of the system, as I said, a bit more to see its purpose and relationship to part A. The Hebrew name for the book is not Leviticus, but He Called, the calling of God's people. in particular the Levites, to minister for God or represent him. They will be the ones administering part B of the system, acting as intermediaries between transgressors and God, making atonement for transgressions or offerings with the animal sacrifices. Note, atonement for sins is only one reason for animal and other offerings. That is dealt with in Leviticus chapter 4, sin. But there's other types of offerings we shall see in chapters 1 to 3. I gave two parts of God's system titles of A and B. A being the commandments of the way to live, as I said, things to do or not to do, as recited to the people by Moses. And B, we shall see, is a sanctuary system administered by the Levites, who represented God's forgiveness part. The sanctuary system will have three components: a temple, a priest, and a sacrifice. The same three components Paul addresses in the New Testament. So to correctly understand Paul, we need to understand Leviticus. Then we may understand verses he uses as
1 Corinthians chapters 3:16. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Verse 19 or 6:19. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own? Hebrews 8:14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Yeshua the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Hebrews 5 verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices, two things, for sins. 5:5. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Verse 5:10. Called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews 7:11. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, and I say the law doesn't mean the moral part, A means part B, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? So he's talking about the priesthood, which goes with the part B we go back to learn about, or part A. Hebrews 8:1. Now the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. Hebrews 9:7. But into the second went the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. We saw when we made the tabernacle system that there was a veil dividing the holy from the holies. And notice this is all to do with priests. None of these priests and sacrifices was in part A. They all were only to part B. Hebrews 9:11. But Christ being come an high priest of good things to come by greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. 9:25. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as a high priest entereth into the holy place every year with blood of others. 10:11. And every priest standeth daily, ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. Now when it can never take away sins, you have to understand that in the context of when we read Leviticus, because obviously God said, as we shall see, that if they perform this action, that he will forgive forgive them their sins. So we can't say that Paul is saying that God was lying. God said, do these sacrificial things, and I will atone you of your sins. So we got to understand what Paul is saying by understanding the book of Leviticus and God's words, not so much Paul's. Okay, so I think I got to Hebrews 10:11. And every priest standeth daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifice which can never take away sins. 10:21. And having a high priest over the house of God. 13:11. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burnt outside of the camp. 9:26. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Romans 12:1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. So as we read through Leviticus, to understand part B, and I said, notice part A never had anything to do with priests and sacrifices. Keep this verse in mind. Hebrews 5:1. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices. You see, there's two separate things for sins. It states, so that's a quotation. My comment. It states a high priest is chosen, taken from among men of the congregation, and ordained to perform functions for the benefit of the other men or the members of the congregation in things of God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Sins being transgression of part A. So that's what leads to using part B for. 1 John 1:8. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. 1 John 3:4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is transgression of the law. That law being part A. So you notice we've used the law twice, yet one part is always talking about part A, transgression part, and the other part, the other time it was used in law, is talking about the sacrificial part B that the high priest performed. Also, as we read, notice the priests are not given the function of performing marriages nor funerals, two of the main traditional functions of them today. And I forgot to say, when I was doing the summary of Genesis, we saw people who had wives. We never saw them being performed by a priest or in a church. In fact, a priest, nor a temple, was not to defile himself by contact with the dead or persons who have touched the dead. We shall see that in Leviticus chapter 11 verse 21. Yet it is customary today to take coffins into churches. And members of the congregation, the church, goes up and touch the coffin or touch the dead body and all that kind of stuff. Okay, excuse me for a moment, I've confused my notes I'm reading from, so I'm just going to repeat some things as I read my second set of notes. I ended the notes on Exodus showing the two complementary parts of God's system, parts A and B. One part cannot replace the other. Each has different makeup and purposes. So whether part B is an animal sacrifice or the Messiah's sacrifice, it cannot and does not replace any of the components of part A, i.e. thou shalt not murder, steal, keep the Sabbath days holy, etc. Were that the case, it would mean that we can now kill, steal, and murder, and it will not be a sin that needs forgiveness. All of the laws of part A were given as one set, so we cannot separate or take out anyone from the set. The set or list has to be kept in its entirety. Thus Yeshua said, if you break one, you break all, because they are a set. If you break one leg, for example, of a table, you have broken the table. We will now look into part B of the system a bit more, i.e. to see its purpose and relationship to part A. The Hebrew name for the book is not Leviticus, but he called, the calling of God's people, in particular the Levites to minister for God or represent him. Okay, Leviticus chapter 1, I think that's all my introductory notes. Leviticus chapter 1 verse 1. And Yahweh called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto Yahweh, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd, and of the flock. Verse 3. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before Yahweh. So God speaks from the tabernacle rather than from the heaven as before, because now the tabernacle is set up and built it. Remember the sign that the law existed from Genesis? In Genesis chapter 4 verse 3. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering, and unto Yahweh. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And Yahweh had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. So that's the first fruits and the flock. And because God just said there has to be of a flock. Leviticus 1:7. And the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. Another sign that existed before, because in Genesis 22 verse 9 we read, And they came to the place which God had told of him, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. So you don't just throw the wood on anyhow, it has been in order. Verse 9, 1:9. And the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, of a sweet savour unto Yahweh. And as I said, remember both Noah and Abraham did burnt sacrifices on altars and with similar practices. And Leviticus 1 verse 17, And he shall cleave it with the wings thereof, but shall divide it not. So that's how God told them to do the sacrifice. And I draw your attention to what Abraham did in Genesis chapter 15:10. It says, But the birds divided he not. So 2 points I'm trying to make here. One, Leviticus 1 deals with burnt offerings, and we can see similarities of the law that existed before the creation of Moses or Israel. Okay, Exodus chapter 2 is another set of sacrifices or offerings for which the temple was to be used. 2 verse 1. And when any will offer a meat offering unto Yahweh, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil upon it, and put frankincense thereon. Verse 5. And if thy oblation be a meat offering, baken in a pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mingled with oil. Verse 11. No meat offering which you shall bring unto Yahweh shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering of Yahweh made by fire. So that's second category, meat offerings, burnt and meat. Chapter 3, remember you're supposed to read all these things yourselves in their entirety. Chapter 3, verse 1. And if his oblation be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be a male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before Yahweh. Verse 16. And the priest shall burn them upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire for a sweet savour, and the fat is Yahweh's. 3:17. It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings, that you eat neither fat nor blood. So we have another former sign, Genesis 9:4, which when God said, But the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. So chapter 1 were burnt offerings, chapter 2 meat offerings, and chapter 3 peace offerings. None to do with sins. So sins so far. So my point, before you claim a contradiction, is the sanctuary system and the animal sacrifices were more than for forgiveness of sins. It is also a system of pleasing God with unblemished offerings and sweet smelling savours. Okay, chapter 4. And Yahweh spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a soul shall sin, and a soul is a human body, not what today we think a soul is. A soul is an actual person. Remember when Adam became a living soul. If a soul shall sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of Yahweh, yes, against any part A, let's say, but no student with ignorance, concerning things which ought not to be done, and shall do against any of them, if the priest that, yes, verse 3, if the priest that is anointed do sin according to the sin of the people, then let him bring for his sin which he hath sinned a young bullock without blemish unto Yahweh for a sin offering. Verse 13, and if the whole congregation of Israel sin through ignorance, and the thing be hid from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done somewhat against any of the commandments of Yahweh, i.e. part A, concerning things which should not be done, and are guilty, verse 20, and he shall do with the bullock as he did with the bullock for a sin offering, so shall he do with this, and the priest shall make an atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. So you see what Paul, to understand Paul in Hebrews, you've got to understand the context of what God says, because he's saying it shall be forgiven them. Verse 22, when a ruler hath sinned and done somewhat through ignorance against any of the commandments of Yahweh his God, concerning things which should not be done, and is guilty, verse 23, and if his sin wherein he hath sinned come to his knowledge, he shall bring his offerings, a kid of the goats, a male without blemish. So sins can be done in ignorance, whether it's for the people, the priest, or the king leader. Just as under our laws, ignorance is no excuse. If you park a double yellow line, or you kill someone without knowing, you're still guilty.
Now, you will never find God dividing his laws into ceremonial or moral, as people have do today, just as an excuse to pick and choose what to keep and what not to keep. That is a division of the devil, let's say, through the whatever denominations want you to continue being ignorant and not following God's laws. Ceremonial laws, if they want to call them that, weddings are ceremonial, yet they follow wedding ceremonies and all the things that priests do, but yet the things that you should be done, they want to call them ceremonial and moral laws. No such division in the Bible. Same as the titles Old and New Testament. Those again are man-made divisions of the deceiver to readers. Okay, let's continue from where I got up to.
Priests can also sin, we saw. God describes precise action to be done by the anointed priest to get his forgiveness. Sacrifices must be unblemished, similar to what Paul says in Romans 12:11, holy, acceptable unto God. But I want you to take from this chapter that ignorance is not forgiven. That's why in Hosea chapter 4:6 or 6:4, it says people perish for lack of knowledge. They die in their ignorance. And in the New Testament, many will come and say, Lord, Lord, let me in. I've done all this good stuff. And he will say, I never knew you. because in your ignorance you continued in your tradition, for example, and you didn't repent of it. Okay, Leviticus.
So we have to. Some scriptures to support what it's saying. Sacrifice must be unblemished. Romans chapter 12 verse 1. Holy, acceptable unto God. So if we do not make ourselves holy and acceptable to God, we are not allowed entry into his new heaven and earth. 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is transgression of the law, that makes you not holy. 1 John chapter 3 verse 8. He that committeth sin is of the devil. So how can a person, or how can persons of the devil committing sin be in God's system under the grace title that people give it today? Is the devil in God's system under grace? Because he's a sinner, and so forth. And will he get into the new heaven and earth or the lake of fire? So clearly, if you are a sinner, a transgressor of God's law, you are of the devil and you will not get into God's promises. Okay, continuing from chapter 2, continue with chapter 5.
Chapter 5 verse 1. And if a soul sin, now here we have category of sinning. Chapter 5. And if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing, and is a witness, whether he have seen or known of it, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. Or if a soul touch any unclean thing, which it be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or the carcass of an unclean creeping thing, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Verse 5. And it shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things, that he shall confess that he have sinned in that thing. And he shall bring his trespass offering unto Yahweh for his sin which he hath sinned. And if he be not able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring for his trespass which he hath committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Verse 5:11. But if he be not able to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he that sinned shall bring for his offerings the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He shall put no oil upon it, neither shall he put any frankincense thereon, for it is a sin offering. 5:15. If a soul commit a trespass and sin through ignorance in the holy things of Yahweh, verse 17, and if a soul sin and commit any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of Yahweh, though he knew it not, yet he is guilty and shall bear his iniquity. So there are sins of action, knowledge, weakness, even if hidden from you. It has to be confessed and then offered, then an offering before you receive the forgiveness. And God is so kind and loving. He gave different criteria. If you're rich, you do something. If you're very poor, you just bring some flour or something. It says there. Remember Luke 13:5 and 3, which says, unless you repent, i.e. confess and turn away from that action, you will perish. That is the reason why the deceiver tells us there are only 10 sins or 10 commandments. And some of those has even been changed. Yes, so that is why they just want us to focus on just the 10. So you break all the others, like Leviticus chapters 23:14, the holy appointed days of God, or the Sabbath days and so on. Or, more than that, someone tell you, Yeshua took away the law, talking about part A. You're now saved by grace, or so forth, or your faith. So note, causing sin by ignorance, no confessing, no sacrifice, means no forgiveness. No calling Yeshua, because you didn't prescribe what God says you're supposed to prescribe through your ignorance. The forgiveness comes by the offering, which comes by the knowledge and repentance. Change the sinner's knowledge, as the devil's trying to do, and you change their eternal destiny to hell. A hardened heart or closed ears is the first stage
I remind you of what I call the God forbid scriptures. Romans 6:15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. So grace doesn't excuse us from keeping the law. Romans 3:31. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. We establish the law. And I think it's Galatians chapter 2 verse 17. If we seek to be justified by Christ, is Christ therefore the minister or the teacher of sinning? God forbid. Shalom, until tomorrow, God willing.